Good afternoon and welcome to the second event of the Global Security Seminar series, in which we try to tackle some of the most pressing events in international affairs. My name is Dr. Mustafa Chirakli and I'm the director of the Institute. Today we continue our discussion by looking at, once again, another important issue which has repercussions for democracy, for human rights, and for the global order, perhaps. And that is, of course, disinformation. Disinformation, no need to say, but it poses significant risks to societies. And we are seeing this phenomenon in a variety of contexts, and more so in the aftermath of what's happening in the Ukraine, but also intensifying significantly in the aftermath of the attacks which have evolved into the war in Gaza. Now, in order to discuss some of these issues in terms of how disinformation takes place, how it is spread, who spreads it, and through what means, we are joined by one of the prominent experts on this, who's been doing some fascinating work on this issue in Africa, of course, looking more specifically at how strategic narratives are spread through, of course, disinformation in Africa. And that is Dr. Madrid Morales, Dr. Dani Madrid Morales. Before I give the floor to my guest, I just want to highlight some of his achievements very briefly without eating into his time too much. Dr. Madrid Morales is a scholar of global media and communication at the University of Sheffield, with a background in broadcast journalism and East Asian studies. Previously, he was an assistant professor at the University of Houston and a PhD fellow at City University of Hong Kong. Before entering academia, Dr. Madrid Morales worked for a decade as script writer and news editor at Televisió de Catalunya and taught at Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, Universitat Pompeu Fabra, and also Universitat Oberta de Catalonia. His work often crosses over disciplines, including media and area studies, international politics, digital humanities, and computational social sciences. Geographically, it focuses on communication processes in East Asia, but also Sub-Saharan Africa, which is at the center of his current research program. So without any further ado, Dr. Dani Madrid Morales, welcome to the show, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mustafa, for inviting me, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be able to share with you some recent research that I've done on the topic, and Mustafa has been very kind to give you a context of the work that I do. I'll be talking today mostly about one type of disinformation and in a very specific geographic context. So as you can see in the title of my presentation today, I am going to be looking at the geopolitics of disinformation, and particularly what we call strategic narratives or strategic disinformation narratives. And I'll give you an overview of what we mean by that topic, by concept, in a second. But before I get to that, let me give you a bit of context as to why the topic of today's talk is what it is. So for those of you not familiar, in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a significant growth in the number of activities by China and Russia in the information space across the African country, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, but pretty much across the continent, Middle East, North Africa, and also Sub-Saharan Africa. I summarized some examples here. For example, on the left-hand side of your screen, you have some of the activities that Russian actors have been playing across the continent. On the right-hand side of your screen, you have some of the activities by Chinese actors. I'll explain a little bit of what type of agreements these are. So if you look at your left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that Russia has been very active in establishing partnerships between some of its leading media organizations, such as Sputnik or RT, also TV Novosti and a few other global-facing media organizations that the Russian government sponsors. And these have entered in multiple partnerships and agreements with local media players across the African continent, from the Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, but all the way down to Eritrea, Congo, South Africa, DRC, and a few others. In many of these cases, what the relationship is a provision by Russian actors of content, of ideas, and materials that then local partners, local organizations distribute across the continent. A lot of what we see in the Russian space is similar to what China has been doing for a longer time. So Russia, even though there's a long history of partnership between Russia and African states in the media space, all over the Cold War, there were Russian operatives in the media space across the continent. A lot of it is quite a new phenomenon, something that happened in the later 2010s approximately, when there were a bunch of Africa-Russia summits, during which Vladimir Putin announced a lot of these partnerships. Now, China, on the other side, has been doing this for a significantly longer time and has a more diverse range of activities. As you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, China entered or re-entered or returned to the African media space in the early 2000s. And at the very beginning, the strategy was to try to promote a more positive view of China. And they did that through a range of activities that you can see on the map. For example, there's all these content agreements that Russia also has. China has similar agreements, but then there's a bunch of other activities such as entertainment activities where China provides soap operas that are dubbed into local languages. For example, in Egypt, recently there was a rather popular soap opera, Chinese soap opera that happens in Imperial China that was distributed on Egyptian national TV. There's radio stations, there's satellite TV, there's investment in media companies. So a very diverse range of activities. Now, what's interesting to see here is how on the one side, China enters the African media space in the early 2000s. Then Russia follows the same path. In both cases, originally, a lot of the activities were related to promoting a positive view of China or Russia. In recent years, we've shifted the view to something slightly different. And this change has to do with the promotion of what we call strategic disinformation narratives. And that will be the main part of my talk today, explaining what these disinformation narratives are and how they're being used by Russian and Chinese actors. We define a strategic disinformation narrative as a discursive construction that is designed to spread falsehoods, mislead, or distort facts with the goal of gaining geopolitical influence. As you can imagine, the arrival or the return of Russian and Chinese actors to the media space on the continent is not free of interest. There's an underlying reason why these companies and actors are entering the African media space, and we can debate what are the main reasons why this is happening. But probably one of the main reasons is an attempt to gain a wider geopolitical influence across the continent. Africa has always played an important role in the foreign policy of both Russia and China. Again, since the Cold War and the USSR years, the partnership between Russia and liberation movements in Africa was very strong, and similar in the case of China. And African countries have also played an important role at the United Nations level, supporting some of the policies and agreements and decisions that Russia and China would like to implement at the global stage. Now, with strategic disinformation narratives, what's happening here is through some of these media agreements that I just described now, we see Russian and Chinese actors disseminating ideas, what we call narratives, that are not always entirely true. And we'll see a few examples of how these are happening. Now, for a bit more broader context, we have to remember that in many African countries in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a declining support for the West, whatever we understand as the West, particularly the US. One of the ways in which we can measure that is the declining number of people who say that the US has a positive influence on the continent. If you look, for example, at the case of South Africa, back in 2010, so that's about 14 years ago, about 80% of the population in South Africa, where it says South Africa, it should say Nigeria. On the right-hand side, I just realized that there's a mistake there. So about 80% of Nigerians back in 2010 said they had a positive view of the US. Now that's gone down to 62. In Kenya, the drop is even more significant. From 94% that had a positive view of the US, now in 2017, the value was 54%. And in South Africa, the figure has also decreased. So there's a context in which the US and more broadly the West are being criticized by local players, by local actors. A lot of it has to do with the interventionist approach that the US has had in its foreign policy towards Africa, whether it's the military involvement in Somalia or in the Djibouti region, for example, or the way the US government has supported certain regimes over the years on the continent. So this declining support for the US can also be seen in the news media. What you see on the right-hand side of your screen is a sentiment analysis of news stories about several different political actors on French-speaking media. As you might be aware, in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a shift in the geopolitical dynamics, particularly in West Africa and the Sahel, where France used to have a very significant presence on the continent due to its colonial legacy and so on. Now, in this region, in West Africa, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, some of these French-speaking countries, sentiment towards the West and particularly towards France has been going down over the years. And we can see how this translates in how the media covers France, for example. If you look at the graph and the green line, you'll see that there's a declining tendency in how the media talk about France. So France is increasingly being talked about in negative terms in French-speaking media, but not only France, also Russia, for example, has been talked about in rather negative terms. And potentially what we're seeing here is a clash of geopolitical views, where the space that was once dominated by France has now been taken over by Russian actors, partly. And in this clash of geopolitics, there's also a clash of narratives. Both France and Russia and other actors are trying to present their views on the global stage, and they do through the media. And that's specifically what I wanted to look at today. And I'll be sharing with you the results of a study that we conducted recently, where we, let me go back for a second, where we look at a comparison of how people perceive some of these strategic narratives that Russia, China are trying to portray and distribute on the African continent. And specifically, we were interested in looking at 4 hypotheses with this study. So the first one hypothesis that we had was in this battle for narratives, the support for what we call Russian and Chinese favor strategic disinformation narratives will be higher in countries that have a closer relationship with China and Russia. For example, South Africa. Many of you might be familiar with the fact that South Africa, China, Russia are all parts of this group of countries called BRICS. BRICS meaning Brazil, Russia, India, and China and South Africa. So because South Africa forms part of this alliance, we should expect it to have a closer relationship with China and Russia, and therefore we would expect that its citizens would support some of these narratives, strategic narratives that Chinese and Russian media are portraying. Now, we also hypothesize that people who get exposed to some of these Chinese and Russian media, and I've shown you a minute ago how there's a widespread of Chinese and Russian media on the continent, we would hypothesize that people who consume this type of media will have a higher adoption of Russian and Chinese narratives. On the other side, and if we take into account the context of declining support for the US, we would also expect that people who have negative views of the US will be less likely to support Russian, the other way around. Right? People who have negative views of the US will have more positive adoption of some of these Russian and Chinese narratives. And the other way around, if people have a favorable view of Russia and China, they are more likely to support their strategic narrative. So lots of hypotheses here. I'll walk you through each of them in a minute, but the context here is we wanted to see whether in a bunch of different African countries, the arrival of Chinese and Russian actors has changed how people perceive some of these strategic narratives. And to answer some of these questions, we conducted a series of surveys in 4 African countries. Overall, we recruited over 4,000 people. We interviewed them for this survey, and we focused on Angola, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Zambia. because they represent a very wide range of engagements with China and Russia. For example, Angola is not a member of BRICS. However, it has a high level of commercial relationship with Russia. It tends to align with Russia and China at UN votes. And it also has a high dependency on Russian arms in its armed forces. Now, on the other side, we have Ethiopia, for example, which has been invited to be a member of BRICS, also has a close commercial relationship with Russia, but it doesn't have a high degree of military agreement. On the other side, Ethiopia has a much closer relationship, military, for example, with countries in the Middle East. So a wide range of countries. And the idea here was, if we look at these different countries that have different relationships with China and Russia, we might be able to see some interesting phenomenon as to how populations in these countries perceive these strategic narratives. Now, our survey took a bunch of different measures, including media consumption, what type of media people consume, what are their worldviews, so whether they have a favorable or negative view towards Russia and China. And we also showed them 4 specific strategic narratives that we describe as disinformation narratives that are supported by Russia or China. Let me show you these narratives one by one. So on the case of Russia, the 2 narratives that we showed people and we asked them, do you support this narrative or not, are on the one side, the war in Ukraine is a consequence of NATO's expansion in Eastern Europe. And the second narrative is sanctions against Russia are the main cause for the current food and energy crisis. Some of you in the audience might say these are a bit contested narratives. Some of you might not agree fully with me when I say that these are disinformation narratives, but we describe these as strategic disinformation narratives because on the one side, they're strategic. Those are narratives that the Russian government would like people to believe. But on the other side, they both see it at the margins of what's true and what's not. It falls in a realm of a blurry line between what's true and what's not. But generally speaking, these are narratives that we describe as disinformation. In the case of China, the 2 narratives that we chose for this study were, if a war breaks out in Taiwan, it will be the United States' fault. And on the other side, foreign forces organized anti-government protests in Hong Kong in 2019. I don't know how much are you familiar with the foreign policy of China, but both Taiwan and Hong Kong are very important topics and issues in China's foreign policy. China really has an interest in making the global public opinion believe that the US is behind a lot of its foreign policy issues. And both Taiwan and Hong Kong, to be fair, are considered by China domestic issues, even though both Taiwan and Hong Kong have a high degree of independence from the mainland China. So here's how this works. We run this survey. We ask people to look at these narratives, and we ask them, do you believe this narrative is true or is it false? When we collected that information, we ran a series of statistical analysis to try to see what are the main reasons that people have to believe or not to believe these narratives. So here's some of the results that this study revealed. I'll start with the 4 narratives and show you the support that we found for each of these narratives. So the first narrative was to do with Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is a consequence of NATO's expansion in Eastern Europe. And what can you see here is the percentage of people that said that this was either true or not true. I want you to look at the pink and red colors, which are the support for these narratives. You can see that approximately 65% of the population in most of these countries actually believe this to be true. So the majority of Angolans, Ethiopians, South Africans, and Zambians do believe that the main reason why the war in Ukraine happened was NATO's expansion towards Eastern Europe. Now, when it comes to the question about the energy crisis that happened immediately after the war in Ukraine started, or I would say the Russian invasion of Eastern Ukraine happened, again, here, between 70 and 75% of the population in most of these countries think that this is true. Now, the blue part is smaller in all of these countries, meaning that less people believe this to be false. And again, I'd love to hear your thoughts during the Q&A on whether you think that these are true or not true, or whether you think that by us labeling as disinformation narratives, we are taking a position. But the majority of the consensus at the time was that if there was a food or energy crisis, it was not specifically due to sanctions, but to other reasons. Now, in the case of the Chinese disinformation narratives, you see a very different scenario here. Almost 70% of the people believe that to be true. The one in Hong Kong, barely 50% in South Africa and Ethiopia, and much less in Angola and Zambia. And one of the main reasons why we hypothesize that there's much less support for this is that while the war in Ukraine was a very present topic, one that affected the everyday life of many of the people that we interviewed, in the case of Hong Kong, that's a sort of a faraway topic that didn't get much media attention. Another narrative, which was the narrative of Taiwan, notice the difference. For example, in Zambia, very few people believe that that would be the fault of the United States. Now, in Ethiopia, approximately 60% of the people said that that was to be true. For context, if you are familiar with the geopolitical dynamics in Africa, you'll know that Ethiopia had a very tense relationship with the US, particularly after the Ethiopian government launched a civil war or initiated a civil war with the north of the country, while in Zambia, relationship with the US is a bit closer. Okay, let me try to make sense of all of this, right? So we have 4 disinformation narratives that have circulated across these 4 countries, and we wanted to understand what are the main reasons why people believe this to be true. And the main ideas that we hypothesize is that it might be because of their views of the US, Russia, and China, or it might be because of their media consumption habits. So let's try to answer those questions. And for this, I apologize because the text here is very difficult to see. The slides have not worked very well here. So let me try to make sense of this. So what we have here is a regression model where we take the scores of people who support the disinformation narratives, and we look at which ones are the main predictors, right? And again, apologies for the slides, but at the top you have the countries, the education level, and then a bunch of other predictors. Now, the ones that have arrows here that unfortunately you cannot see very well are 2 things. On the one side is views of the US. So whenever a country or whenever somebody had a negative view of the US, they were more likely to support the disinformation narratives. And whenever somebody had a positive view of Russia, in this case, they were also more likely to support the disinformation narratives. In other words, it's not so much the media consumption that makes people believe this, even though, as I said before, there's a widespread presence of Russian and Chinese media companies across the continent. That's not the main driver of their attitudes. A lot of it has to do with previous existing views of the US particularly. The more people dislike the US, the more likely they are to support some of these narratives. And we see the same pattern for the 4 other narratives. Unfortunately, I might not be able to show the slides to you because they are not showing great, but believe me when I say that in the 4 cases, the main predictor was anti-US sentiment. So to wrap this up and to open the floor for some of your questions, what are the main takeaways that we get from this study? The first one is that we need to understand that even though a lot of attention has gone in recent years towards Russian and Chinese arrival in the media space, this needs to be understood in a broader socio-political and historical context that shapes how these public opinion dynamics happen. On the one side, there's a long legacy of Sino-African and Russia-Africa relationships that shape some of these public opinion dynamics. There's also domestic dimensions. If you take, for example, the case of South Africa, there's some political party that has a very strong anti-US narratives that is spread across the country. And those anti-US narratives are so prevalent that some of these Russian and Chinese narratives become very prevalent in public opinion discourse, even without the arrival of Chinese and Russian media companies. The second is that a lot of the dynamics that we see here are not easily understood in terms of global information flows. In other words, it's not so much that there's a spread of ideas from Russia and China towards Africa, but a lot of it has to do with domestic dimensions. As I said before, one of the main drivers in what we've seen is anti-US sentiment. The more people dislike the US, the more likely they are willing to listen to Russian and Chinese narratives. And then all of this leads us to the idea of, if there's any actor that tries to counter some of these narratives, if anybody wants to say some European countries, maybe the US government is attempting to counter some of these activities that Russia and China are doing, any of these efforts cannot simply go at debunking the narratives or doing things like fact-checking, for example, because a lot of these ideas are very deep-rooted in the psyche and the public opinion context, and therefore some of these governments will need to use different strategies to counter these narratives. If anybody is interested in reading a bit more about this paper has been published recently, so you can use the QR code here on the screen to download the paper where you can read about this a bit more. And with that, I'll stop so I can take a few questions and I can try to explain a bit more the context or anything that's not clear from here.
Thank you so much, Dani, for that excellent overview. And you've certainly shared with us quite a few, quite a lot of food for thought. For sure. Now, I've been getting some questions from students, although from different channels, I must admit, from some from WhatsApp. And let me remind you, and let me remind all our audience that feel free to share with us your thoughts and your questions over YouTube. Please, if you can, there's a chat box just under the video, and you can share your questions with us on that. Now, from the questions I have, one of the themes that's coming across, Dani, is in relation to the interplay between the Russian and Chinese media outlets that are spreading disinformation and the extent to which they've penetrated local media discourses. I wonder if you've done, if you want to have a go at this one.
Yes, of course. Thank you for the question. The reality is that a lot of Russian and Chinese media actors have penetrated the media landscape of different countries. I'll give you a couple examples. For example, if we look at the case of Libya, right after the fall of Gaddafi and the division of Libya into two blocks, China was very active in trying to enter the media space. And for a while, for example, China was the only foreign country that had media organizations on one side of in Tripoli, when most international media organizations were on the other side of Libya, for example. In the case of Russia, shortly after the fall of Gaddafi, they were active in creating its own media companies. So they bought a private TV outlet that was used to distribute Russian propaganda. So we've seen this infiltration of Russian and Chinese actors in the media space. We've also seen it quite clearly in the Sahel, where the clash between the French government and the local military juntas that came after a series of coups that happened in the Sahel. Some of these military juntas expelled French media from the country. So Le Monde, which is the largest newspaper in France, or France 24, which is a large TV company, were expelled from Mali, for example, and from Burkina Faso. And that vacuum was occupied by Russian actors. Many of you will be familiar with the Wagner Group, with Yevgeny Prigozhin, who allegedly died in a airplane accident in Russia. So the Wagner Group had a very strong presence in the Sahel in many different spaces. They launched their own TV network. They took over several radio stations. And even after the death of Prigozhin, even though the Wagner Group has lost some of its strength, they remain in the media space. There's a TV channel called TV Afrique in French that's run by local journalists with a lot of support by Russian actors. So to your point, there's been an entrance of Russian and Chinese investment, journalists, and content in many different African countries. A lot of it has to do with the fact that this content is provided for free, and therefore it's quite attractive for the media houses. But also on part of it has to do with the fact that many people in some African public opinion are quite tired with some of the Western narratives and some of the long-standing colonial attitudes that France, UK, and the US have. And they're quite receptive to the fact that these new voices are coming in. Something that it's quite interesting as well, for example, that Al Jazeera has a very wide presence across the continent. It's one of the most popular TV networks in many, particularly English-speaking African countries. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Al Jazeera presents a alternative view to the one that you would find on CNN, BBC, and so on.
Excellent. The other question is on this anti-US sentiment, and especially you mentioned that is very much prevalent in South Africa. Of course, you were there recently as well, so you had the chance to speak to people and experience this firsthand. But I was wondering to what extent is this an anti-US sentiment, or where do you draw the line between where the anti-US sentiment stops and this global South discourse starts? Because let me give you one example. Well, it's of course it may not be an easy fit, but what happens in Turkey? There's again a similar in foreign policy, a discourse where it's very difficult to draw a line between the anti-US sentiment, especially when it comes to those difficult issues like Gaza, and this discourse of the global South taking a more prominent role in shaping an alternative world order. We see this in the rhetoric of President Erdogan, saying that the world should be greater than the five, targeting the Security Council. But the US anti-US sentiment is always lurking in the background. Is there, and it's difficult to draw a line. But I wonder if it's the same in the case of these countries, that it's somehow framed in this greater narrative for a global role for the South. And also why, you mentioned again that South Africa deserves special attention because it's part of the BRICS. But I wonder if there's anything more to it of South Africa's role in trying to, hijack this sentiment to carve itself in a slightly different position, perhaps. Something that we may also use to understand, what's happening with bringing the legal case against Israel.
Those are very interesting points, and I'll tackle it from different angles. And I think it's very interesting that you also bring about the case of Turkey. And one of the reasons is that Turkey has also had a very recent entrance in the African media space. TRT, the global branch of Turkey's public media, has created a TRT Africa component where they broadcast in local languages across different countries. And very interestingly to point out is that when TRT Africa launched its operations in Africa, the first thing that they did, they hired most of the journalists from BBC, and then BBC had to shut down some of its Hausa service in Nigeria. So Turkey has been very active in that space as well. Now, the first question that you asked was about where do we draw the line between what is anti-US sentiment and what is sort of a more global South needs a larger voice element. And I think that that's probably the biggest difficulty for us to establish what is the main driver. And one of the things that we wanted to do with this study was to try to bring the emphasis a bit more on this anti-US sentiment that has for a long time been quite present in many African societies and for many reasons. And the case of South Africa, for example, the US government for many years supported the apartheid regime. And that obviously is something that South African population does not forget easily. And there's this tendency of the US and some other European powers of quite easily erasing historical memories, as if so the past events do not carry on any consequences into the present time. And you mentioned my visit to South Africa, where I was just last week, and I had the opportunity to talk about with some diplomats from the US that were present in South Africa at the event that I was attending, and it was difficult for them to understand the idea that the US was seen as a negative force on the continent, because for a lot of the current members of the diplomatic force, the US has a positive influence on the continent. It has very progressive values. It's helping reduce gender-based violence. There's very important issues that the US is doing. But now again, I think it's important for us to look back and remember that as much as the US can be a force for good in some areas, the US is also a very clear imperialistic force that has had a very negative consequence for a lot of the population on the continent, and that will not be forgotten quickly. So it is very important to emphasize that this anti-US sentiment, anti-West sentiment, sort of anti-imperialistic, anti-colonial ideas are very present in society. But, and that's the point that you were making that's very interesting, there's also this idea that the global South is emerging as a counter force to these colonial powers that have been present in the continent for so long. And South Africa is a very good example of this, as you pointed out. Interestingly, South Africa was not part of BRICS at the beginning, right? Originally it was BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Then South Africa was brought in a little bit sort of to counter the dominance because of these other four countries. There was a bit of debate at the beginning as to what role South Africa had. It's not the largest economy on the continent. It's not the largest country on the continent. Some people might say that South Africa doesn't really speak for what happens in most of the other parts of the continent. Nigeria, Ethiopia have very different realities than the one South Africa has. But at the same time, South Africa has used its presence in the BRICS to really sort of live up or like increase its global geopolitical stance. The case of bringing Israel to the International Court of Justice because of the genocidal attitudes that the Israeli regime has had in Gaza is a very clear example, but also the role it played when Vladimir Putin, for example, was allegedly going to travel to South Africa. South Africa is a signatory of global treaties, so South Africa would have had to detain Vladimir Putin, on whom an order was placed for his detention. Now, South Africa was very clear when it said, we will not detain Vladimir Putin because Vladimir Putin is part of this BRICS alliance. So there's a clear dynamic in support of the global South in which South Africa plays a big role. And it's a dynamic that's spreading across the continent as more and more countries feel empowered and use the agency to counter colonial attitudes that we've seen by other players. I think that's an interesting development this weekend, for example, where a Senegalese delegation went to Paris with a new prime minister recently elected. And one of the first things that the Senegalese delegation said to President Macron was, we don't want French troops on our country. Right? And France has had a free check to have military presences across West Africa. Now, many of these countries are now saying, well, this is not your space anymore. This is not your backyard. We take over our agency and we decide who stays in our territory and who doesn't. And we can get in a debate on what's driven this, right? Is it France's behavior that has led to its decline in popularity, or has it more to do with the arrival of new players who are offering an alternative view of what the security space might look like? And Russia obviously is the main actor here, where they're offering some support in terms of military, but also in the development of certain key industries and so on. And in these spaces where these narratives play an important role, where Russian media, Russian actors, Russian diplomats are spreading certain dynamics on the continent that are resonating with the audiences, because these audiences have a history of unpleasant relationship with France, the US, or the UK.
Excellent. Thank you, Dani. Now, another theme I'm picking up from some of the comments and questions that I received earlier. What to do about it? Well, this is, of course, a difficult one. You hinted at it as to what sort of counter strategies could be developed. But I was looking at your work earlier on, which was published on the conversation, and very, very good piece that should be read together with the article you shared as well. I think our students would definitely benefit greatly from reading those two together. I picked on the fact that sometimes the Americans and the French are also involved in this game of spreading strategic disinformation narratives uh, or something along those lines. Well, so I wonder, what would be the best way to tackle this? I mean, what can be done? Because usually in these kind of contexts, you need grassroots initiatives. You need to be engaging with the relevant stakeholders, and having this kind of a bottom-up approach. But when you have, and you certainly need funding for these, right? But when you have these kind of actors who are also in it, sometimes explicitly or sometimes implicitly, how do you get around it? What do you do? What can be done to tackle, or what sort of strategies do we need to be using?
You made a very important point here, right? And I forgot probably to say this earlier, and the fact that we are focusing in this paper on Chinese and Russian, what we call strategic disinformation narratives, doesn't mean that they're the only players doing this, right? And as you correctly pointed out, there's evidence that both the US and France have also engaged in similar behaviors. There's a very well-known takedown by Facebook, by Meta, of pro-US and pro-French inauthentic behavior on Facebook and WhatsApp that was spreading both French and US strategic narratives, some of which, again, fall on this blurry line between what's true and what's false. A lot of French efforts have been at discrediting the Russians and promoting French values and French ideas. How much of that is true or not, it's a different story, but obviously both the US and France are quite involved in that. In terms of responses, I think it depends on who wants to respond to it, right? On the one side, if we think, how do other global powers want to react to it? UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran have very keen interest in increasing their presence on the continent, particularly for economic reasons, but also for strategic and geopolitical reasons. So what has been their strategy and what could they do? Their main strategy has been to enter the space in the same way that the Russians and the Chinese have, at least in the media space, right? That you have TRT Africa Development, but also Al Jazeera opening a bureau in Nairobi and trying to expand its presence on the continent. You have Al Arabiya present across many of the North African countries. Iran has also increased its presence and so on. So one possibility is, say, if there's a battle for narratives, you want to enter that space with your own narratives. And that obviously is very beneficial for the actors that have the resources to do this. Now, what I see problematic in that is that we forget or we leave aside the agency of the countries where these narratives are being distributed. And let's not forget that a key element here that's missing is, what do African societies, journalists in many African countries have to say about this? It's not just about the arrival of foreign actors and distributing their ideas, but also it should be the local population that is able to tell their own stories and their own views about these topics.
Absolutely.
And obviously the main idea here will be, you need to support quality journalism that happens in those countries that's able to speak to the realities of those living in those countries. And I think that that's the missing link, right? A lot of the efforts are going towards discrediting certain countries or countering narratives with more narratives, but not enough is going towards supporting local journalism, supporting local stories, supporting local think tanks and other actors that should be pushing out their own ideas about what their countries should be doing. And we see this a little bit these days. There's quite an interesting phenomenon, again, in West Africa, of political influencers that are taking the space on YouTube, on TikTok, and sort of countering these efforts by foreign powers by presenting their own views, some of which very critical, some of which a bit dangerous to some extent, very nativist, very sort of nationalistic views, but to some extent very valid. I like to make the point these days about the importance of remembering that as in a more healthy global environment, information environment, we need to promote the information sovereignty of different countries. A lot of what's happening is that the arrival of foreign players is curtailing the information sovereignty of states. On the one side, you have Chinese companies dominating undersea cables, and there's foreign actors controlling the satellite TV industry. When the European Union decided that Russia Today, RT, could no longer be broadcast on European satellites, that also meant that many African countries could not get RT, even though they had never made the decision that RT could not be broadcast in Africa. But because the satellites are owned by European companies, those European companies shut down those satellites, right? So in a way, you are taking away the ability of a country, say, I don't know, Mauritania, to decide what goes into their information space. And it's a bit of a controversial view in the sense that when you empower countries to be information sovereign, that can also be used in negative ways. If it's a very dictatorial, authoritarian regime, that they can forbid information from going into their country, like happens in Eritrea, where there's no foreign information happening. But at the same time, it's important for us to be realistic, right? Like in Spain, where I come from, in Cyprus, in many other countries in Europe, countries are sovereign to decide what goes into their information space. And I think we need to empower African societies in that sense as well.
Absolutely. I think I've just made a note of this, the information sovereignty. That's going to be an interesting concept that's probably likely to stay with us in these kind of challenging contexts, whether for good reasons or bad, equally. Now, I can see a couple of comments on the YouTube coming in as well. So just to tackle those with you, please, Dani, if that's okay, over the next couple of minutes. So the first one, there's no name. The person did not share their name. It says, how can African nations reclaim agency in shaping their future amidst the dominance of foreign narratives and pervasive disinformation? That's a very good question. Dare I say I might use this for an essay for in the exam paper.
Yeah, okay. Well, the students will be happy to know that might be an essay question, right? And it's a difficult one to answer. And I would sort of bring it back a little bit to the discussion that we just had now about what to do about it. On the one side, I think it's important that we stress the need for a free, independent press and how important it is for local communicators to be able to do their job freely. Unfortunately, that's not happening everywhere. And some of the countries that have been more belligerent and more adversarial towards foreign powers are countries that are making an authoritarian turn. You have many of the military juntas in West Africa where freedom of speech is not respected. So I think that the agency has to come from supporting a true, free, independent media environment where there's a free flow of ideas and we can debate ideas in a civilized and equal way. Unfortunately, that's not happening as much. Also, at a more global level, I think it'd be important for foreign powers to acknowledge this agency as much as possible. I think there's some interesting cases in Kenya and in East Africa, for example, where some local media companies have taken advantage of their sort of strong agency when the Chinese arrive or when the Russians arrive and say, look, I want you to broadcast this content because I'm giving it to you for free. Well, some of these Kenyan media companies have said, oh, well, pay me for this, or like I will decide what I broadcast, right? So exactly. taking control over the agency, not so much letting foreign powers come and dominate your media space, but deciding what you do and how you do it and what terms you're doing it. And there's a little bit of this happening. Unfortunately, both China and Russia are quite good at co-opting the relationship. Russia organizes these Russia-Africa summits. The last one, there was Sochi, and then there was one more recently in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And in those spaces, it's mostly Russian actors that dominate the discourse. China has done that as well. There's this forum of China-Africa cooperation called FOCAC. And in that space, there's a memorandum at the end with a list of actions, and many of those are very China-focused. But there's a push in some African societies for more agency of African actors. And I think that there's a movement towards an increase of agency. And the same way that we've seen it say, some of the Sahel countries towards France, where they say, well, your troops are no longer welcome in my country. I think in the long term, we're going to see more of the same with some of these other actors that are a bit more new in the space. And some political parties, like in Uganda, for example, we had some anti-Chinese sentiment. We've seen it in Zambia as well, where there's a critique of some of the extractive relationship that China has with African countries. And we've seen that happening a bit more. So yeah, agency, key, important, keep it always on the table and the dialogue. And obviously, the most important thing is empower local quality journalism. I think that would be very important.
Excellent. Following on from that, just to take the last one, it's a series of bite-sized comments from our PhD candidate here, Emmanuel Ikena. And it says, hello, Dr. Madrid Morales. Though I joined late, but I just read through the abstract of the paper. First, I'd like to say that it's a good work. But the countries you studied, I think, are countries in the southern part of Africa, he says. And these parts of Africa can be regarded as soft and manipulatable, perhaps. The sub-Saharan Africa countries will better give a clear insight on this topic. Mm-hmm. Okay. Don't you think, he says, social cultural norms in these African countries can hinder the survival of these practices by these foreign entities? See the case of Kenya protest against the finance bill.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for your points. We could get in a debate on whether I think that these are easier, softer targets. To some extent, I can see the difference that I believe you are making, right? So I think there's a clear difference in how countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, DRC, even Sudan approach this relationship with foreign powers compared to how Zambia, Angola, South Africa are doing it. There's also a clear difference in sort of the Saharan, I wouldn't say sub-Saharan, but maybe Saharan countries, like countries in the Sahel, for example, where there's been a change in regime in recent years, and the new regimes that have come into place are a lot more belligerent towards foreign interference. That's not so much the case in some of the sub-Saharan African countries that we've seen. South Africa, Angola, even Zambia have a continuity. There hasn't been a clear change in the political environment. But I do take your point, and I think that there's a push in some of these countries towards a stronger view of what these actors are doing in their space. As you say, the Kenyan protests are quite a good example, but we also have the case of Ghana, when population has moved against the illegal mining by Chinese companies in their territory. We've also seen it in Mozambique, where there was some Russian interference in the elections a few years ago, and then some of the political elite moved towards criticizing that. So obviously, there's a realization that Africa, unfortunately, is becoming another chess piece in this global geopolitical game. And that's also been the case in the past, where Africa was used by colonial powers in their global balance of power, and there's no willingness for that to happen again. And I think African societies, as you very well know, are very mature, and they have their own agency, and that's not going to happen. And the elites are also aware of this. Obviously, there's a gap between those in power, and usually those that have power want to stay in power, and therefore they like the status quo. And as long as the relationship with, say, Russia or Turkey or Saudi Arabia are beneficial to them, they're unlikely to break that chain. But at the same time, civil society movements and so on are much more critical of some of these relationships. And we've seen some transformations there on how some of the extractive relationship has transformed in recent years. And it's a space to watch out. As I said before, we've seen some movements, political movements domestically in some countries where there's a lot more push towards, let's take control of this relationship. Let's not leave our countries at the hands of foreign powers. And the media is an important space for that to happen.
Excellent. So there is still hope yet, I guess.
Yeah.
That's a very positive message that we should definitely be hammering. Well, I think this is all the time we have for today. But Dr. Dani Madrid Morales, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing us very fascinating insight into this difficult context. And I've certainly learned a lot. And I think we ought to be doing the next one face to face, and hopefully we'll try and get you to come and visit us here in Cyprus. So I'll definitely be in touch to arrange that with you. Right. Well, that's again all the time we have for today. Thank you to our audience who've been watching us. And do make sure that you follow us on Twitter. We are on Twitter, we are on Facebook, and on Instagram to stay informed with all the upcoming events and research. Thank you, and I'll see you soon.